to the Amistd Research Center. I think it was 3 years ago we decided that we wanted to do something and sponsor some activity at the center that would allow us to feature our collections. It's one thing to always talk about the nation's oldest, largest, arguably most comprehensive archives that chronicle the history of African Americans, and to say that we have over 600 collections in which there are some 10 to 15 million documents, 250,000 photographs, and on and on. But we thought as a staff it would be appropriate for us to feature those collections and to feature them in ways that we weren't just targeting a New Orleans audience, but we would target audiences globally, as it turned out, because we began at that point to adopt collections management software that allowed us to place finding aids online, and that's an activity that has grown unto itself, that has prompted growth, however, at the center, which is contrary to what some people thought initially, that if there was all of this access to these documents, then there would be no need to come in and kick the tires or handle the documents themselves. And that hasn't been the case. Requests have increased, visits have increased, tours have increased, our opportunities to work and create educational projects have increased. And therefore, we're quite pleased with the progress that's been made. In fact, yet do I marvel, Countee Cullen and the Harlem Renaissance, which we entitled the exhibition tonight, is one of 4 that we have sponsored this year, solely on account of color, segregation, and African American medical training, which last year when we planned, we realized that the National Medical Association was going to be in town. The founding of the American Committee on Africa, More Than Just a Game, African American Athletics, and Civil Rights were all previously produced. So we're grateful that you're here tonight. We hope that if you allow us, we didn't want you to stand in a registration line, but if we can get an email address or just directory information, we'll make sure to include you on our mailing list and keep you abreast of not only our activities at the center, but we'll update you and keep you aware of our progress as well. I always like to begin these meetings by introducing the staff at Amistd, whom I'm sure would quickly say they are the force behind the scenes, etc. Guys, would you stand and introduce yourselves to the audience, please?
I'm Laura Thompson, Director of Processing.
Hi, I'm Anderson, Director of Libraries. Shannon Lewin, Assistant Office. Christopher Harden, Director of Libraries.
Felicia Linder, Content Marketing. Laura, Audio Visual Project.
Thank you very much. And I think that right now, I'll have Chris come up and say a few things about the exhibition, things that you might be interested in as you go around and take a look.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. We're very pleased that you can come out and join us for this talk exhibition tonight. As someone who works in the reference department here, is often working with researchers when they come in, I know I can speak on behalf of the staff to say that we're very fortunate that we work with a wide clientele of researchers who come from, as I say, around the block and around the world to come to use the resources here at the center, from elementary school children who come in working on a project to someone such as Dr. Molesworth, who's working on a biography or book project. We're very fortunate to work with a great group of people who come to visit the center. But especially for us, it's always wonderful to see a project from start to finish. From a researcher coming in from the very first time to begin that research, to being able to see that research grow into, in this case, a very much needed book. And so we're very pleased to have that. As part of the evening, if you haven't already had a chance, please do take some time tonight to go through our exhibition that Lee mentioned, the front two cases as you come in the center, and then up on the mezzanine gallery, this exhibition is drawn from the papers of Countee Cullen that are here at the center that give not only a view into his life and work, but also a number of his associates and contemporaries that were very important individuals in what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Afterwards, Dr. Molesworth will be signing copies of the book, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any questions and such. And to do that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Charles Molesworth, who has written on other Harlem Renaissance figures such as the landlocked, and was a great pleasure to work with when he came in. He'll be telling us a little bit about his research and the writing of the biography of Countee Cullen.
Thank you, Chris. And let me begin by thanking Lee Hampton and Chris Harder and the staff here at Amistd for inviting me to give this talk, and even more importantly, for treating me so nicely when I came here several years back to begin the research in the life of Countee Cullen. Two omissions to begin with. The first omission is Tom Worth. Some of you know him. He couldn't come. He felt that the storm created such a situation at home that he couldn't fly out to join us. So Tom isn't here, but he very much wanted to come. The other omission is a very painful one for me to admit to, but it has to be done. The portrait of Countee Cullen on the cover of the biography is by Winold Rice. Some people call him Rees, but I think the correct pronunciation is Rice. But he was a German artist who was very active with figures in the Harlem Renaissance. And the Rice family gave us permission to use that for the book jacket cover, or the front of the book jacket rather. And they were incredibly generous. And somehow or another, something went bump in the night, and we failed to credit Winold Rice for the portrait. If you have a tomato or a cabbage, throw it now and get it over with. This is a horrible, oversight, and I apologize to the Rice family. I think it's one of the best things about the book. The portrait is so stunning, and to have failed to acknowledge it as being from Mr. Rice and his estate is, I hope, almost unforgivable. Anyway, on to the talk. I thought I'd talk a bit about Cullen's life in documents. This, to my mind, wanders a little bit, but I think it keeps coming back to the notion of the idea that we all come to terms with in literary studies, and even just as general readers of literature, of separating fact from fiction, and fiction from rumor, and rumor from myth. They're all slightly different one from another. And so what I want to talk about is how an archive provides a documentary basis that will do a great deal, not everything all the time, but will do a great deal toward getting rid of false rumors and false myths and replacing them with facts, one of the obvious functions of an archive full of documentation. So it's called Cullen's Life in Documents. It's about 20 minutes long, and afterwards I'll be happy to answer questions. Now, if you had resorted to the internet to discover the biographical facts of Countee Cullen's life, you would end up with a very mixed and rather inaccurate picture. You would, for example, be told by the Columbia Electronic Encyclopedia that Cullen was born in New York City, and his technique was conventional and based on the model of John Keats, and that his mood passed from optimism in the 1920s to pessimism in the 1930s. Every one of those clauses is a little off, but especially that he was born in New York City. We have no idea where he was born, but almost certainly was not New York City. Britannica biographies adds to the blurred picture by claiming that Cullen was reared by a woman who was, quote, probably his maternal grandmother. She was almost certainly his maternal grandmother. You'd have to go from probably to almost certainly to make that sentence true. The Cambridge Dictionary of American Biography would lead you further astray by the blanket statement that, quote, his particular style has not survived the era. Well, every well-known writer suffers from similar errors in his or her biographical representation, and after their careers have ended, the errors tend to calcify. Even if they merit a careful scholarly biography, there will be elements of distortion or mistaken facts that persist, no matter how careful the biographer is. But each case of mistaken identity offers some object lessons of its own. The German poet Rilke once said that fame is the sum of misunderstandings that surround a new name. Lady Gaga, take notice. This suggests, of course, that fame remains fickle, and that whatever it is when it first appears, it will soon alter, at times strangely or even completely. Cullen was indeed famous, and so he has gathered his share of misunderstandings. Most notable of all the misunderstandings is just what exactly was the nature and the time of his fame. He became best known by serving as the fulfillment of a specific public quest, a desire the public itself was often not fully conscious of, namely the quest for an African-American poet who could write lovely poems that somehow or another would be beyond the question of race. This desire was implicit in the interview that Cullen gave to a Brooklyn newspaper when he was still a teenager. In a sense, his answer to the questions put to him by the reporter about his double identity as a black man and a poet were the fullest statement of his way of resolving the problem. What he said was that he would write out of a language tradition shaped by many different poets, but chiefly those who flourished in England in the early 19th century. But at the same time, his outlook on life, all of his experience, all his values were distinctly shaped by his being an African American, and this fact would be freely allowed to influence his poetry. Though his answer was firm and coherent, the question that prompted the answer faded only slowly, and it persisted in one form or another long enough to influence the shape and measure of Cullen's posthumous fame. We can say now, I believe, that the question of how he could be both a proud black man and a skilled traditional poet was a skeptical question. Furthermore, it was skeptical because no one had accomplished such seemingly contradictory tasks before Cullen. And we should acknowledge that Cullen did indeed accomplish it and became famous doing so. But the fame was not easily won, and some quite formidable obstacles stood in Cullen's way. The two most noticeable obstacles, and the ones that complicate not only his fame, but also the possible shape of his biography, are his identity as an orphan and as a gay man. Cullen sought to overcome both of these identities by an apparently simple strategy: concealment. Of course, concealment is rarely simple, and in facing both these obstacles, Cullen succeeded only partially. Everyone in Harlem knew he was an orphan, and his homosexuality was more or less an open secret. But this isn't in itself a claim that Cullen failed to deal with these often burdensome identities. In both cases, it must be borne in mind that he behaved bravely, because it took real courage to live life as a gay man in the 1920s and 30s, and it was never easy for Cullen to acknowledge his lack of a stable childhood in a respectable nuclear family. By his 15th birthday, his status as an orphan changed, and he entered the household of Reverend Cullen, who was the pastor of the largest church in Harlem. By his 25th birthday, his concealment of his sexuality shattered when he entered his disastrous marriage with the daughter of W.E.B. Du Bois. We know very little in a documentary sense of what strategies Cullen used when these two obstacles changed shape, as it were. But we do know something about what happened next. Cullen went on being a writer, a teacher, a novelist, a dramatist, and a figure famous throughout his chosen community. Cullen wore his fame lightly, which is itself a difficult achievement. True, a well-known portrait of him, which is in the case behind you, which Chris has put out, by Carl Van Vechten, shows him wearing his Phi Beta Kappa key. He actually told a fib to the reporter who asked him about it. He said, "I never really set my cap on it," he said. But in fact, we know from other documents that he was desperate to win a Phi Beta Kappa key. In addition to any lack of pedantic remarks that Cullen might have made, there's also the lack of any thoroughly introspective documentation from Cullen himself. As he wore his fame lightly, he also declined to present himself as an aggressive innovator like, say, Ezra Pound, or a breaker of conventions such as Bruce Nugent. And his life was too short for him to become an international figure such as Langston Hughes or Du Bois. In terms of documents, there is little by way of a journal or a diary, though he frequently unburdened himself in letters to his lifelong best friend, Harold Jackman, and to Dorothy West, who was his soulmate from her arrival in Harlem in 1925 until Cullen's death. A few personal essays written for Opportunity or Crisis add to the picture of a man engaged in the issues of his time. But the peculiar flavor of modernist angst or anxiety or the self-exposure of the modern artist that we expect from writers of the first half of the 20th century are simply not part of Cullen's output. Now, a biography cannot linger unduly on what is missing from the documentary record, though biographers like to moan about it. "Oh, if I only had the diary from this year, everything would be clear, right? And my job would be easier." But with Cullen, there's a lot that we don't have. However, in his case, we must consider another more significant lack, namely a full measure of years. Cullen died before his 43rd birthday in January of 1946. At that time, Langston Hughes, his near contemporary, had more than 30 years to live. And Du Bois, born a generation ahead of Cullen, would enjoy another 17 years of life. And Alain Locke, who was born 20 years before Cullen, outlived him by 8 years. The last decade of Cullen's life can be measured from 1935, when he more or less stopped writing lyric poetry, to the final frustration of his not living to see the Broadway musical St. Louis Woman, on which he had spent considerable, in fact painful amounts of time and energy and hope. Most writers are haunted by Scott Fitzgerald's assertion that there are no second acts in American lives. Nevertheless, if Cullen had enjoyed the success, artistic and monetary, that St. Louis Woman would have provided, he might well have gone on to a second act as a man of the theater, reveling in the performative arts which he hungered for since his high school days as an aspiring writer of Tin Pan Alley lyrics. He was desperate to write a best-selling lyric song. He would write off to these companies, sort of like, learn to draw, send this in and we'll make you a great artist. There were actually ads in the magazines, which I found here for the first time, where they would say, send in your sample poem and we'll turn it into a great song for you and make you millions of dollars. He worked at it very hard. But often the desire to see a writer's life as expressing a singular project leads us to fill in the blanks with suppositions and imaginary events. We can try and define the works of an author, but it is almost impossible to unify the life. Artistic works have many motivations, but they can be subject to repetition, expansion, modification, and other actions that create a unifying pattern. But life itself is too contingent, too arbitrary in its forces and its rejections to be submitted to a single theme. Still, the biographer wants to have a pattern in the life and in the work, regardless of which is the cause and which is the effect. For years, Cullen's life possessed the unity of having been adopted and raised by a well-known Protestant preacher in Harlem. This led to the conclusion that Cullen was divided between the callings of high poetry and righteous religion, two callings that can overlap or grate against one another. Added to this was his status as an adoptive son, which generated an insecurity that eventually led to his depression and his stunted growth. I don't mean physically stunted. Such a divided consciousness was further riven by his life as a closeted homosexual, though his sexual orientation was, as I said, an open secret throughout the Harlem Renaissance. We can also claim for Cullen, mindful of the canonical status of the phrase, the double consciousness that Du Bois formulated and which became one of the touchstones of African American literature. Quote, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Close quote. The simultaneous awareness of oneself as both an American and an African American, a native son, and yet defined by others as a social outsider. Cullen experienced the double consciousness as fully as any of his artists in the Renaissance. Any of his fellow artists in the Renaissance. In fact, he may by some measure have experienced it even with more than average intensity. As for example, when Langston Hughes, somewhat covertly, accused Cullen of wanting to be white. But no writer enjoyed his blackness more than Cullen. And Hughes knew this and admitted as much in an essay published after Cullen's death. It was in his famous essay, however, that Hughes allowed his discussion of the relationship between poetry and race to contain the charge that Cullen wanted to be white. This is a famous essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. He says, a poet wants such and such. And so everybody above 125th Street knew who he was talking about, even though he didn't name him. This strikes me as grossly wrong-headed and factually wrong. However, because Langston went on to outstrip Cullen in terms of fame, and many would add in terms of artistic achievement, his charge against Cullen has stuck. Add to the charge of wanting to be white the equally undocumented record of Cullen's personal attitudes towards his own sexuality and how it worked with or didn't work with his artistic talent. And the tally amounts to a picture of Cullen as a subject of a failed life and a limited body of lyric poetry. Despite the existence of a relatively full documentary archive, in which you are now sitting, Cullen's life and work began to be explained away by phrases that were high-minded but rang hollow, such as, quote, one of the leading poets of the Harlem Renaissance. Always gives me a little twitch, because yes, he was that, but he was other things as well. He was a poet before the Renaissance and after the Renaissance. More directly negative assessments appeared, as when Darrell Pinckney christened Cullen as, quote, the sweet singer of Tuckahoe, which is a really sort of demeaning nickname, referring to the last years of Cullen's life, which he spent in Tuckahoe, which is a very comfortable suburb north of New York City. And the late Melvin Dixon, who was a colleague of mine and good friend, described Cullen's poetry as, quote, dull as dishwater. But in fact, there is at least one interpretation of Cullen's life and art with which I profoundly disagree. I will not mention the author's name because I don't know anything about him and have never had the chance to discuss the matter with him. But his article is called A Key to the Puzzle. This title should be a tip-off, for no one is a puzzle to which there belongs a key. But this article, which was published in 1987, stands in for a host of articles about Cullen that address the puzzle. The puzzle being, what happened to Countee Cullen? Why did he stop writing poetry? Why is his reputation faltered? Why did he not, get a job teaching at a college rather than a junior high school in Manhattan? Why does he seem, again, to be so limited after, say, 1935, the last decade of his life? But this particular article, in a way, tops all of them, for it argues, in summary form, quote, Cullen's refusal to accept race as a basic and valuable segment of his total identity was an evasion which prevented him from straightforward and clear development. I'll say it once more. Cullen's refusal to accept race as a basic and valuable segment of his total identity was an evasion which prevented him from straightforward and clear development, close quote. The last phrase demands a closer look because there is a certain sense in which some biographers must use the documents presented to them to create a straightforward and clear picture, a single interpretation that will somehow or another unlock the puzzle. This article lets slip another premise, namely that one's race must be accepted as, quote, a basic and valuable segment of one's total identity, close quote. But race is too problematic a quality or feature or fact or value. The very dispersal of categories to which race belongs tells us how plastic a term it is. But it is too problematic to be categorized as a, quote, basic segment of one's total identity. And identity, I would argue, is too complex and evolving to ever form a totality, at least when it comes to real-life historical individuals who are, after all, the key subjects of biography. Biography must frequently deal with the unified view of a complex life, even if the biographer realizes that such a unification distorts the documentary record in some way or another by omitting some documentary evidence. I wake up at night thinking I should have put in one more page about something and quoted it, excuse me, by having one document trump or outweigh another, or using some kind of scheme to induce the documents to offer up their evidence in one particular, with one particular attitude or another. There are also biographies that are written against other biographies, where the writer sets out to correct what appears to be a distorted view. Most prevalent of all, perhaps, is the biographer who seeks a monocausal explanation, one thing that explains the whole life, planning to employ a single overriding force that will make all the events and all the works of a writer's life fit into an indispensable explanatory formulation. One of the readers who vetted my manuscript before it was accepted argued that I was obliged to treat the rumor that the Reverend Cullen was himself a homosexual and that there was reason to assume that he had sexually initiated Cullen. This rumor, according to the reader, hired by a very prestigious university press, this rumor would serve as the key to unlocking all of the mystery of Cullen's personality and, by extension, his poetry. Since I discovered no documentary evidence at all to support such a claim, I decided to omit any discussion of the rumor. Facts, it is said, are stubborn things, but so are rumors, and so too are documents. Documents speak for no party, and they offer no indisputable monocausal explanations. They await our patience and our care while waiting for us to bring them to the level of expressive meaning. In Cullen's case, we might think of two sets of documents. On the one hand, his correspondence and official records, and on the other hand, his poetry and his literary prose. The biographical desire to make the first set illustrate the second, and vice versa, comes to us as a desire to tell a whole truth, a truth greater and deeper than the sum of its parts. But because literary documents, by definition, have multiple and often unstable meanings, using them to anchor the meaning of a writer's life demands nearly infinite subtlety. Such subtlety can become a trap and leave us in a morass of the contingent and the accidental. We honor the importance of artistic expression in a special manner by assuming that the artist is a shaper of singular forms, and that the power to shape is the power to give us highly defined, even definite truth. So the biographer is tempted to collude with the artist in forming a kind of certainty. Such collusion should not lead the biographer to outshape the artist, however. For in the last analysis, the life of the artist is as contingent and baffling as that of any of us. Few of us make the well-shaped lives that we sing about in our songs. My favorite example of this is from another biography I wrote about the poet Marianne Moore, who at a certain point in her life moves to a small town in Pennsylvania by the name of Carlisle. And she was a very pious woman from a very pious family. And for some reason, when they moved, they joined the Second Presbyterian Church, not the First Presbyterian Church, which was in fact right across from the house they moved into. Now, why did the family choose the Second Presbyterian Church? It was there that she came to know one of her lifelong important friends. So it's very significant that she chose the Second Presbyterian rather than the First. Why she did that? Haven't got a clue. I don't think anyone could figure it out, unless they got lucky and found a document. That would be the only way. For several decades after his death, Cullen's life came down to us without a convincing sense of unity, except for this negative one that I talked about and that other critics have talked about. There were instead a number of figures or situations that stood out against the background of the Harlem Renaissance. His early success as a prize-winning poet. That's sort of the best place to get a sense of Cullen's life. You know, up until 1925, where he's very, very famous, and then you can sort of say, okay, you know, and let the last 20 years of his life sort of slide away from public view. There's also his indebtedness to John Keats and Edna St. Vincent Millay. In other words, to see him as a derivative poet. You know, he's the poet who comes after these other poets. And of course, there's the failure of his first marriage to Yolande Du Bois, which was a story, I hate to say, well worth telling, because it's just scandalous enough that all of us are interested in it in one way or another. And then there are the long years as a public school teacher and the growing silence of the last decade. However, there were documents that could refute each of these partial accounts, even as certain facts remained out of any documented reach. And we were also fortunate in having biographies of Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as important biographical accounts of Zora Neale Hurston, and there are more in the works on Charles S. Johnson and Harold Jackman, among others. So the absence of a Cullen biography for many decades after his death can be seen as both the cause and the effect of the diminishment of his reputation. No one can be sure how the appearance of a Cullen biography will affect his reputation. Will it bring about a reassessment? Will it only confirm the opinions of those who see him as a lesser figure? One could possibly take comfort in saying that at least we now have a biography based on documents rather than on gossip or rumor. A life story built on the historical record and the literary work rather than a set of urban myths. But even here, of course, we have to be cautious and modest. More documents will possibly come to life. Those we have available, thanks to the care and dedication of the Amistd Research Center and its staff, will, I trust, be examined and re-examined by more and more scholars in the biographies, more and more scholars and biographers and critics and poets. Many of you know that there is now an online publication of all of Cullen's correspondence that is being worked on and will prove of great help to all future Cullen criticism. Lisa McKenna is hard at work every day on this. And there is an edition of his collected poems planned for the Library of America series that will, I'm sure, increase the readership for Cullen's work. We should also acknowledge the diligence and generosity of Cullen's second wife, Ida Roberson Cullen, who spent many years after the poet's death making sure that the documents in his life were collected and eventually made available to all. In a real sense, she was the premier biographer of Cullen's life and work. Considering the complexity of Cullen's identities and the excellence of much of his poetry, there will in all likelihood be more biographies of him in the future. This is one of the chief benefits of having a life that exists in documents. Thank you. Questions?
Well, you don't need me up here to help you out.
You
But,
never know.
I just want to encourage, first of all, thank you. And I want to encourage your questions, and as I speak, a hand goes up. Dr. Watt?
Yes, I would like to thank Mr. Molesworth for the very enlightening lecture, or talk rather, on his book. And I'm very anxious to read the whole thing. But I'd like to make two comments and then ask you a legitimate question. Comment one has to do with rights and views. The 1926 essay, although it seems to accuse Cullen of wanting to be white, is really an accusation that Cullen did not wish to identify with blues people enough to satisfy Mr. Hughes. Secondly, you very wisely did not bring up the name Michael Lomax, but we're decadent enough in New Orleans to do so. So when Michael Lomax said, that, using a nicely mixed metaphor, that there was a key to the puzzle, I think Dr. Lomax was actually using the rhetoric that was native to the Black Arts movement at the time when he wrote as a kind of spin-off of his dissertation. Now, my legitimate question, I would like to know a bit more about what you actually discovered in examining the correspondence between Dorothy West and Countee Cullen.
Okay, thank you for your question and for the remarks too. I will say, as I said, just repeat again, I don't know Professor Lomax, and I take your point that the idea of the key to the puzzle can be formative and useful. It can help you focus. You can say, you know, I'm looking for the forest and I keep bumping into the trees without some kind of guide or key. So I think it's an argument I've had with myself as well as with my colleagues as to whether or not you can have a monocausal explanation of a biography. I always end up believing you cannot, but I see the force and the power of it and sometimes even the necessity of it. So that point is important. Now on to Dorothy West, a figure of great charm to me. I found myself very entranced by her in her letters to Countee. The thing that I discovered most is that, or that made the most difference to me, is they exchanged letters in the late 20s, early 30s about forming a literary salon. And it was to include Augusta Savage and various other people. And they really meant it to be a serious undertaking. And it was also out of that desire to form a literary salon to continue the work of the Harlem Renaissance and to, in a way, in a slight way, to institutionalize the work of the Renaissance. That Dorothy West went on to found her two magazines, Challenge and New Challenge, and to publish Cullen's poetry and pieces by Miss Robeson and lots of other people in there. Van Vechten has a piece in one of the issues. It's an interesting periodical. Chris Harder is interested in a small magazine. This is one that has real interest. It goes by like, you know, a firefly on a summer night, but it's really got an interesting story behind it and interesting work in it. So it was the depth of their commitment to extending the Renaissance historically into another generation that struck me as very, very moving. She also has a very guarded attitude towards Cullen's sexuality. It's hard in reading the letters to know for certain whether or not she knew Cullen was homosexual, and whether or not, even if he were, he might not somehow or another find a way to live with her, that is, with Dorothy West, either in a marriage or, you know, just together as a relationship, because they were very close. I don't think they were ever sexually intimate, but I think that she admired Cullen greatly. And it comes through in the letters. The letters are very rich. I talk about them a lot in the book, and I'd be anxious to see if the book answers the question better than I just did. Yes?
Thanks. I actually have a slew of questions. I'll try to limit it to a few, and then if there's time, come back for a couple more. If the assessment of some of the critics who said that it was like dishwater are correct, can you explain his fame, his celebrity, a little bit, please?
Mm-hmm.
And you said, and because of your focus on the sort of archival aspect of this, at one point you said everybody north of 125th Street knew that Langston Hughes was referring to him. How do you know that everybody north of 125th Street knew
Okay.
anything?
Fair
But,
question.
you know, I mean,
Right.
It's an interesting
Yeah.
question.
No,
And then I'm really interested in his relationship with the Du Bois family, his relationship with W.B. Du Bois, and his political activities and affiliations
Mhm.
and interests, for one thing. And was that marriage, and I gather you go into it in the book, was the marriage a knowing marriage of convenience, or was it not?
yeah. Let me start with the last question first. A whole lot of people didn't know enough when that wedding took place. And the person who knew the least, I'm afraid, was Yolande, who really had no idea what was happening in her life, much to her painful regret. Let's go on, though, to fame and poetry dull as dishwater. Melvin Dixon was, as I said, a colleague and a good friend of mine. He worked in the English department with me for many years at Queens College. But he was getting his licks in, so to speak, against Cullen as a way of defining his own poetry, which is what Hughes was doing when he said Cullen, you know, was like, by wanting to be a white poet, he really wanted to be white. People use aesthetic principles and stands as political weapons and as social accusations all the time. I do it myself. Barely a day goes by that I don't do the same thing. But when it comes to the record, I think you have to stop a minute and say, oh, wait a minute now, you know. I never had a chance to ask Melvin Dixon, really? Dull as dishwater? I would say to Melvin, if he were here with us today, listen to this one. Because the problem is not how to go from dishwater back to fame. The problem is how to go from the fame to the dishwater remark. And that is partly because of what happens in between, which is the black arts movement and Melvin Dixon's own life, and et cetera, so that he has to get rid of the lyricism of Cullen. And he wants to get rid of the 3 or 4 most famous Cullen poems that everybody knows and quotes all the time. You know, and one of your poems becomes so famous that people quote it all the time, other poets, you know, get kind of grumpy about that. You know, they think, you know, it's a cliche, this is tired, it's worn out. You're using this one poem to represent, you know, a complex body of work. And I just want to smash through that and say, no, you know, finally, everybody's pious about this poem, but it's not that good as a way of changing things and altering things. The relationship with the Du Bois family. Very complicated. I'll tell you just a little bit to maybe whet your appetite. When Yolanda figures out that Cullen is homosexual, he tells her that he's homosexual. She, you know, is in extreme distress and writes her father what's happened between them. And the father, not to his great credit, rather takes Countee's side and says, you know, it's sort of Yolanda's fault because she was too naive and she should have known better, et cetera. It doesn't quite say that, but it's if I were a young girl in distress, I wouldn't want to have a letter from my father that sounded like the letter Du Bois wrote to Yolanda. Let's put it that way. But his relationship with Du Bois never faltered. Du Bois went on to write for Crisis, reportorial cultural journalism while he was in Paris, and he sent it to Du Bois because they had an arrangement. Du Bois had promised to pay him for each article, and he couldn't pay him because he darn near drove himself into bankruptcy paying for Yolanda's wedding. You know, there were 13 bridesmaids, you know. There were 3,000 people in attendance. Police were called in to retain order, you know, because all the crowd outside the church couldn't get in. So you'd think that he had had enough of Countee Cullen and would never want to see him again. Not so. He maintained the integrity of their contract. He published Cullen's articles and paid him eventually. He wrote him a very nice letter saying, I'm a little short on cash. Can you wait a little while? Of course, Cullen was short on cash too. Every African American in the Depression was short on cash. So they stayed together. There was a big dinner for Du Bois later on. I forget the year exactly. But Cullen wrote a poem for the occasion. It was printed on the dinner menu, you know, the fancy celebratory dinner for, I guess it was Du Bois's, maybe his 65th birthday. I'm not sure exactly what the occasion was, but it was a big one, and they all wrote poems for him, including Cullen. So they, to use the vernacular, they kept it together, you know, their friendship and they had tremendous respect for each other. I mean, Du Bois really thought Cullen was it in a certain sense. I mean, Cullen was writing a kind of poetry that I think it's safe to say Du Bois himself would love to have been writing, you know. And so he really admired Cullen just almost immeasurably. And as you know, he had lots of trouble with the other writers of the Renaissance, you know, not to mention Van Vechten and Wallace Thurman and all of them. You know, there's a lot of people who didn't make Mr. Du Bois happy, but Cullen did.
And then what about how much do you really know? I mean, was there something?
Oh yes, about above 125. Yes, there's a taped interview with. I have to look at Chris Harder to help me through this. There's a taped interview with one of the female writers of the Renaissance. Which one now I can't remember. In which she says, you know, that everybody knew, and I mean that testament alone is enough, I think, because it's very sweet the way she puts it. I mean, I don't mean sweet in a sappy or a genteel way, but she says, you know, it didn't bother much of us because we just associated that with a certain kind of aestheticism. You know, if you were very sensitive, you were likely to be gay, or if you were gay, you were often, you know, active in the arts and drama, et cetera, and this was taken for granted. So it's the other side of the sort of homophobia that existed then and still exists today in the African American community. That, you know, there, you know, obviously there were people who accepted it with certain understandings. In 1920, it wasn't possible to be openly gay in the sense that, you know, you could announce it to everyone, except, of course, for Bruce Nugent, who's a case all by himself. Go ahead. You have deep pockets. Oh, no, Mike.
Yeah, there's a parallel to the situation that you were talking about concerning, you know, the possibility of Cullen's sexual initiation by his
Right.
adopted father. In James Lord's biography of Giacometti, where, you know, he kind of dances around this issue of whether Giacometti was molested as a young boy when he was traveling with another man. And then years later, Lord writes an appendix to his biography explaining that he's come upon documents that prove that this was in fact the case. And he writes this short book as an addendum explaining that it's important that the record be set straight. However, he in no way intends to imply that this explains Giacometti's achievement. So could you see, I mean, pursuing a path like that yourself in terms of the sort of Cullen situation?
In other words, it's there, but it's not there, or
Well, I mean, it's a fact.
right.
Which the documentary record has made indisputable
Right.
about Giacometti's life. But it still doesn't explain to the biographer after his years of
Right.
immersion in Giacometti's life, his documentary archive, and his achievement.
Right.
It still does not adequately explain
Yeah.
that achievement.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. It deserves more than the brief answer I will give it. My dodgy answer is to say, if and when they find a document about the Reverend Cullen, call me and we'll talk. You know, in other words, I don't like to speculate about Reverend Cullen. I looked pretty hard to find where the rumor that he was homosexual began. I know where it was, shall we say, calcified, and that's in David Levering Lewis's When Harlem Was in Vogue. You know, it's there, and it's there in a way that is not, to my eye, very fair. He talks about how people were suspicious because the Reverend wore his wife's clothes, and the altar boys weren't safe in his presence. I didn't like the way that was handled. And in fact, if you flip back to the notes, there's no documentary record of that. There's another guy, Gene Wagner, who writes a book about African American poets in the Renaissance. And he, I think, is the first person to start the rumor. And I have a footnote in the book that spells that out and how I think it became you know, a vicious circle. It began to, you know, nobody ever wrote it down because there was this shame attached to it, but everybody knew it, and that's why, you know, no one wrote it down. If some people had known it and some people hadn't, then somebody might have written, you know, yada, 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 you know, so it gets kind of self-serving there.
Could it also be that with trying to explain why someone's a homosexual, that instead of maybe at that time especially thinking that the individual was born that way,
Right.
that someone had to make them homosexual?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the supposition behind it, that the initiation, the molestation, if you will, which is a word we use all too often today, unfortunately, but molestation, initiation, whatever, there's some transformative act that, yeah, at the age of 12 or 14 or whatever, and then, you know, for the rest of your life, you're trying to expunge or come to terms with, or whatever verb you want to use. Yeah, that's very much the issue. You know, you as an old teacher of mine said, you got to pay your money and take your choices, you know. And you're a Freudian or you're not a Freudian, or you're this kind of Freudian or that kind of Freudian. I've read Freud. I can talk Freud, you know, all day long. But it doesn't satisfy me as a biographer to use that kind of monocausal event as the key to the puzzle. It's just something doesn't sit with me. And I've taken lumps for it. I mean, again, my earlier biography of Marianne Moore, I said, I've read all of the documents and nothing indicates she ever had sex with anybody, man or woman. Oh, several critics went crazy. No, you can't say that. Of course she did. Well, who, when, where? It's not in the record. You have a question?
You read a quote about someone saying that Cullen evaded the use of race or
Yes.
significant factor in his development. I don't think it would say that about any other artist except for black artists. And so I think that criticism is kind of unfair to say to level against him.
You mean the one I quoted or the one? Yeah.
I don't think it would say the same thing about a white artist.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And
In fact, to me, it's a form of racism to even
yes,
as a criticism.
I understand that, and I sympathize with that. And when I got that quote, I rejected it on the face of it. But what's interesting about it, well, maybe not interesting to some people, but it's interesting to me just as a kind of mental puzzle. Why wouldn't anyone and everyone's ethnicity be a factor, but only a factor, not the factor in someone's art? I mean, we want to know that, famous composers are Russian or Czech or Spanish. I mean, it means something to us, but it doesn't mean everything. It's not the key to everything. And so I think the relationship between ethnicity and race, which I know are not the same thing, but those two categories, those two human attributes or qualities are, you cannot disconnect them completely from artistic imagination, but they're not the same thing, and the one doesn't explain the other completely.
In fact, if you accept that as a major factor, then you're limiting yourself as an artist.
Right.
And to become a great artist, you have to move beyond that.
Right.
You have to become universal.
Right.
To become a great artist.
I agree with you. Right. I agree with you, but you and I will have trouble with other people saying just exactly what we mean by beyond. Right? That's part of the problem. We're going to come back to you.
I
Yeah.
just want to make a remark to try to put this in a context. I am not going to disagree with either of you gentlemen on the points that you're making. However, as someone who's interested in literary history, I want you to be aware that as these statements have been made in the past, we have to be very attentive as far as we can. We don't know exactly what was in anybody's mind, but to the rhetorical dimensions of the statement.
Yes.
So that when Langston Hughes says Cullen, and he doesn't call him by name, was not wishing to identify enough with his people, that is not a racist statement. It is a racialist statement.
Right.
And there is a supreme difference between being racist and racialist.
Right.
There was a reason that many Creoles in New Orleans would not understand that black people had an investment in what James Weldon Johnson said about creating a particular kind of poetry. Here in New Orleans, the Creole had created their particular kind of poetry in 1845
Right.
in Les Sonnets, which is not mentioned enough in the history of African American literature.
Right.
However, I'm going to be very adamant in saying that when we accuse people of being racist, we also have to look very carefully and I do mean very, very carefully, at the context and the rhetorical conundrums that they raise in utterances.
Right. No, point very well put and very well taken. Absolutely.
I'd like to also add one thing to this part of the equation. I don't think that maybe even in a tertiary way that it falls along, but with my friend's comments up here at the front and Dr. Worth's comments, the idea of a marginalized culture or the other, and the whole idea also, which I think is a strange aperture to look through, is just the black and white kind of space of things. But with the idea of an artist, for instance, identifying, maybe say more so with another ethnicity or color, there are so many Albanians, for instance, in Kosovo, who identify with a whole other culture, not their young kids, I'm talking about, 15 to 25. In New Orleans, there's a lot of white kids that completely disavow their whiteness. I mean, real street kids that absolutely have nothing but enmity towards the fact that they're white or any whiteness, and choose to emulate or choose role models or empathy or empathize with entirely with another culture, and seek to find themselves in a very truly imaginary way who they are. So I know that complicates matters a lot, but one of the problems, and I think, with both of the gentlemen's comments, continuing in New Orleans, certainly, in William Marrero's household, who grew up on Port Street in 1892, who was one of the progenitors, a bass player of jazz. He was Spanish. His wife, a Spanish African. His wife was French African. There were Irish, there were Germans. And in the same household with the original Creole Orchestra, whose members were Bunk Johnson, Willie Bunk Johnson, and Big Eye Reynolds, and DeLito. Anyway, it's just incredibly complicated to try to fathom, but from a young kid's mind, of wherever they're coming from their own artistic imagination, to go outside of their skin and or completely just deny it, whatever color or racial background they come from. To me, I don't think is an exception.
Yeah. No, I think I hear what you're saying.
I
Yeah.
want to say, though, that I'm not making that comment about Countee Cullen.
Right.
I just want
Yeah.
that is a certain that's a big tenor
Yeah.
of our community.
I think one way to just start on the corners of the immensely complicated question of race is to make a distinction between, and this is a little like the distinction between racism and racialism, a little bit like that there is the problem of how one group is taught and socialized to regard another group. And that is usually productive of racism, because the group that is being annealed and formed and unified around its belief system, which includes a negative view of another group, that's the fundament of racism as a political and social force in the world and in history. The other side of it, and you need both that, which is sort of the universal side, and the individual side, in which some, white kid from Queens wants to be a rap singer, or whatever. And, each of us individually struggles with or enjoys the give and take of racial difference and ethnic differences and et cetera, but you can't solve the large social and political group conflict by pointing to or dragging out or elaborating on highly idiosyncratic personal conflicts and pleasures that come with the fact that we're different from each other one to one. So somewhere between the universal group belief and the individual struggle and life experience, lies this vast area in which things are probably even more confused than they are at the extremes. And they're plenty, confused at the extreme. I mean, I think the key to some of this, well, not the key, I'm against keys, sorry. The important thing to remember about this is, I think, from Alain Locke, who said that race is not a biological category. It's a cultural category. And if you think about it as a series of cultural transactions, it makes a lot more sense. But it doesn't make it go away. It doesn't cure racism to say that. To acknowledge that there is in the racialist understanding of each other a profoundly useful and important sense of difference one from another. But again, as I say, it doesn't make the problem go away. It's still there in this large universal sense of this group over here and this group over there. Basically the white supremacy. That's the problem. Is white supremacy. It's not, the problem was never the problem, of or for black people. It was a problem for white people, that they led themselves into believing that they were somehow or another superior as a group to these other groups all over the world. I mean, not likely to be true on the face of it. If you just look around the world a bit, it's likely to be a astounding falsehood. Yes.
If I may.
Sure.
Return to the second part of my list. So he died at an early age at 43.
Right. 42 actually.
42.
Yeah.
Why did he die? What did he die of? I'm curious, your interest in doing a biography. I mean, evidently from your mentioning of Marianne Moore, you're interested in doing biographies of poets, I gather, or maybe not entirely.
Not quite.
I'm curious
Yeah.
how you came to do a biography of this person.
Yeah.
And I just happened to, while I was listening, but just kind of grabbed a book and found Dorothy West in this Who's Who. And she was mentioned in 1998. She was working at the Vineyard Gazette, apparently.
Yes.
To the Vineyard Gazette. So
yeah.
So in addition to working in archives, do you talk to people who may still have been living, who may actually have known him, or have been close to people, or family members of people who, sometimes family lore maybe can't be documented.
Right.
It can be quite informative and interesting.
I can do each of those fairly quickly, I think. The cause of death was he had a cerebral hemorrhage, which was brought on by uremic poisoning, that is, the failure of the kidney to flush the system. He had a poor diet, and he had stomach problems all throughout the 30s. He talks about it a lot with Dorothy West in their letters, his ailments. I got interested in Cullen because I wrote a biography of Alain Locke, who was a mentor for Cullen, and they had a correspondence and a personal relationship, which I found fascinating. In each of the biographies that I've been involved, there are, because I've asked myself this somewhere along the way, and I came up with a surprisingly coherent answer. I was very proud of myself. There are certain common features. None of the three had a biography already written about them. And each of the three had an extensive archive. So I could go in myself, so to speak, and look at the written record and say my say and get out like that. I left out one, the Marianne Moore. Oh yeah, I'm not interested in writing about poets as such. I got interested in Locke for complicated reasons, but I'm interested in writing about writers, but not necessarily poets.
Oh, and I also was curious, just because of Dorothy West's history if, and the vineyard as a community.
Oh, yes, yeah, right, thank you. Very quickly, an anecdote. When I started writing my biography of Marianne Moore, I would go to places, innocently, and people would say, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a biography about Marianne." "Oh, Marianne Moore. I knew Marianne Moore. Let me tell you this story." Then they'd tell me an anecdote about Marianne Moore. And Kenneth Koch, whom some of you may know, New York poet, did this to me too. We were actually had spent a lot of time together. He told me this story about Marianne Moore, and the other famous writers all told me their stories. And you have to take my word for this now, but it's true. Every story said the same thing. Once you actually looked at what was in the anecdote, it was all the same thing. She was an old woman who was a little dotty, but a genius. As we sometimes say, please. It just wasn't enough to go on. It didn't come to anything. In fact, I used to tell my students the paperback edition of the Complete Poems of Marianne Moore had on the back a quotation, as a blurb, "An eccentric genius." This is the way everybody talked about it, Dotty old woman who did these crazy things. Kenneth Koch's story I thought was the most stupid of all, even though I really like Kenneth Koch. But she was walking down the street with Kenneth Koch in the Greenwich Village one day. And they passed this dog that was sitting on the porch, the stoop of some apartment house. And it was an astoundingly ugly dog. And Marianne said to Kenneth, "I want to give you a gift." And he said, "Really?" She said, "Yes, look at the ugly dog. It's a gift." That's what dotty old ladies do, right? They tell stories like, sorry to get off on Marianne Moore, but, leave ugly dogs out of your biography if you ever write one. That's my rule.
I think that might be a good
Okay.
That might be a good point at which, since we're very interested in having you comb the archives
Yes.
at Amistd, I'd like to encourage all of you to please comb the archives at Amistd, either by coming in and working with the staff, or perhaps going to our website and looking at the finding aids of many of our collections, where you can make determinations about the content of those collections and where your interests might lie. I'd like to thank Charles for coming out and for being a part of our exhibit. Last year, when we decided that we were going to make the Cullen exhibition the final of the year, we had no idea that the book would be published and that we would have Charles saying that he would come down to do a talk for us. So we're very appreciative, and we're very appreciative that you're here tonight. We're asking that if you would give us an email address or some directory information, we'll get you signed up on our mailing list. In fact, this week we will finalize plans for next year's exhibitions, and we would like to start to get the word out. Please take in the exhibition. There are cases upstairs, starting down here. There are additional refreshments outside, and perhaps you can ask a few more questions of Charles if you wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you.